Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. Sorry, Buna's not here at the moment, and he's not here tonight, so I might just ask if people can move a little bit closer, just so you can see some of the slides are going to be a little bit heavier. It's a nice and very interesting topic tonight on Christianity and the environment, and I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions. Let's grill Ragai as much as possible. We also have Matthew here, who thinks he can escape because he's not giving the talk, but was also involved in the prep. Yes, I'm pointing out that Matthew, who's sitting there behind James, who's hiding his head, is also involved. And there are many other Aletheia members that I can see. We've got Marianne, Mina. Who else have we got? So feel free to grab any of us at any point if you've got questions. And no one's moved closer. Come a bit closer, please. And before you sit, how about we take the opportunity to say a quick prayer together, just the Lord's Prayer. And with the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Lord, make us worthy to pray thankfully. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, to forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Fathers. So I'll leave you with Ragai, and just as a note for those that are new to Aletheia, all questions are welcome, but we generally just like to keep questions at the microphone, if possible. So if you've got questions, there will be time at the end. If you have a burning question, please feel free to line up. And like I said, please feel free to ask Ragai any questions at any time. All the best.
Thanks, Mina. All right, thank you for coming, everyone. This is a topic that we haven't really touched upon, and so I'm hoping we can generate a bit of discussion today. For those who don't know me, my name is Ragai. I'm one of the members of the Aletheia team. So today we'll be focusing on Christianity and the environment, and two main points will be discussed today. The first point is, as Christians, we may have this perception or this understanding that the spiritual world is more important than the physical, and so we will be questioning whether or not that should be the case. The other question is that if we are to be concerned with the earth and with the environment, how much should we be, or should we be at all? So the reason I start off with the focus of the spiritual over the physical is that I'm sure most of us growing up will have an idea that we are asked to pray a lot, go to church. There seems to be an incorporation within the church community and the environment of the church that we prioritize that instead of sort of earthly matters. And we may grow up knowing that earthly things are sinful, etc. And there may be a combination of these views, three views that may have altered these perceptions growing up, or through the growth of the church over the hundreds of years, thousands of years that we've been there. So the first view is what I would call the teleological view, or the view of the afterlife, or of heaven, of the other world. And so some misinterpretations might be from key verses in the Bible that are taken out of context. One sure example is Jesus speaking with Pilate and saying that my kingdom is not of this world. And obviously Christ calling us to the kingdom of heaven and saying that the kingdom of heaven is not a part of this earth could be perceived as we are building sort of a mansion, or building an investment in something that doesn't belong here. And so anything that we build up here may be for naught, or may not progress further into what we may actually need. Another thing that pops up is what we often hear in church masses at the end of, I think it was the Catholicon. The Catholicon. So during the Mass, there is a response at the end saying, "Do not love the world, or the things of the world," and it's all its desires and things like that. And that's a reference from the first epistle of John, chapter 2. And so, even though we are in the church focusing on the spiritual, there's also this misconception or this discarding of all the physical things that come into play in our daily life that we need to sort of put away. There's also the theological view that we're made in the image of God, and a perception of that might be that being in the image of God, we should be more spiritual rather than being physical. That also comes from our belief of subduing the earth and having dominion over it, which takes its reference from Genesis in the story of Adam and Eve. And so, again, when we isolate this verse on its own, we can see subdue and dominion are very forceful words that might involve our own selection of what we do to the environment. Another point of reference, which also comes before with the sort of the teleological view, is that Christ's phrasing or wording to Satan during the temptation on the mount: man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And so again, even though it was a challenge, a common misinterpretation of that is that our sustenance, our daily sustenance of the physical, is only to keep us alive, so much as to build our physical life as the only priority. The other thing might be external sources from outside the church, a very cultural or historical view that has influenced the church from different parts of the world. Western Christianity, or parts of Western Christianity, is known to have adopted some of this as a hierarchy of natural order. And close to around the 13th century, even before the scientific method was introduced, there was sort of this revolution where instead of us gazing and appreciating nature and glorifying God for the things that He created, it transformed into a more scientific viewpoint, in that we were trying to find out how God could do these things, and it was rather taking away the focus from God and rather trying to break down and sort of analyze every single minutiae of the environment and of nature. So the Great Chain of Being, this is an artwork or a display from 1579. It shows how the common thought process of the time not just influenced social status and hierarchy, but also the perception of every other living and non-living thing in the earth. And so this may have influences from earlier Greek times and just sort of evolved as it came into the West. So we have God first and the angels, kings and queens, commoners, and then beneath that we have animals, plants, and non-living things. So attributes of the earth, and that might have integrated into the mindset of modern Christianity in all its various forms. These views are only partly correct, or some of these views may be incorrect at all. The Orthodox Church has a much deeper view and understanding of the physical world and the role that we play within the natural environment. And what happens is, as I'll show you very shortly, is that if we misinterpret individualized verses or teachings without going back to the roots of Christianity, that the personalities that we develop, the culture that we develop, starts to influence how we treat the world around us. So can anyone, I'll point it to the floor, anyone have any examples of negative interactions with the environment? Any concerns that you might see on the news? Anyone brave enough? Animal cruelty is one, yep, thank you. It's always on the news. Overconsumption, thank you. Anyone else? Sorry? Oh, if only that was a more commonly thing. We can say wastage. Anything else? How many coffee? Well, it goes back to overconsumption. Global warming, thank you. Okay, so I'll go through a few examples. So pollution, in its various forms: water pollution, air pollution, pollution that incorporates into the soil, becomes a part of the natural, or becomes an unnatural environment. I didn't put noise pollution there, but that's also a significant factor that not only influences us, but wildlife and the animal world. Consumerism, overconsumption. I'll also include in there just the wastage of food. I was reading a statistic very recently that somewhere in the 20th century we were less than 500,000 metric tons a year of total food wasted. That might be an under-exaggerated statistic, but I think in the modern era, within the past 5 to 10 years, we probably waste around 12 million metric tons of food a year. And so that was an exponential growth, and just the amount of wastage that we're not sort of being aware is quite concerning. Overgrazing, so just utilizing the soil without allowing it to rest and sort of regenerate leads to just complete decay and then non-use of land. And this is usually with farming practice, but also has to do with restricting the area where wildlife can also consume food. Extinction of flora and fauna, I've just got a few examples there, but there's thousands of examples. Humanity is probably the sole contributor to just the majority, the landslide majority of things going extinct within at least the past couple of hundred years. So to the left is the western black rhino in Africa. That's only within the past, I think, 5 to 10 years been declared extinct. I don't think they have a population large enough to at least put it back onto the endangered list. A less recent or less modern example is the dodo bird, which was hunted the minute settlers moved to certain islands, and then they would actually use the meat and hunt them, and they were hunted to the point of extinction. They no longer exist. And even the plants are obviously influenced. This is the Rafflesia plant. It's quite a beautiful plant from Indonesia. It's currently endangered, on its way to extinction, unfortunately. Animal cruelty in all its various forms, both for domestic animals and also for non-domestic animals, animals that we use for production, for food. So it ranges from just callous acts of animal cruelty to irresponsible pet ownership. I work as a veterinarian, and so personal experience leads me to sort of appreciate all the work that people go into animal welfare. But also there's concerns with the management of livestock. A current problem with Australia at the moment is that there is the live animal trade, which carries itself to the Middle East, and it's currently very controversial because of the distance that cattle are transported. And so there is a bit of overstocking, or a lot of overstocking. There's also a lot of disease that spreads, and just again, sort of the amount of deaths that are occurring on those trips. War and destruction of the land. So I've got 3 images there, different time periods. Actually 2 very similar. The one on the far left is in France during World War II. The middle picture is Hiroshima in 1945, and Yemen is on the right in the present day. So a fight for resources, just because of our human nature to want and dominate land, has led to a lot of tragic and lost lives. I can't comment on sort of the geopolitics, but I think it's something that does play a part in the secondary destruction of the land and of the human life that's also influenced. So again, a few statistics. I'm using a much older article from 1997 from the journal Science. During 1997, up to 1/2 of the Earth was transformed by human interaction. About 20% of the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere was contributed to from human involvement. About 50% of the world's total surface freshwater was being utilized, and 30% of the total bird species that became extinct in the previous 2,000 years were caused by humans. These are just some of the points that I picked out from that report, and that was about 20 years ago. So there is a growing statistic of all these contributions that humanity has played a part in the environment. And the other point that was mentioned was climate change. So within the past 50 years or so, there's been a few conferences, what's called the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. It's a group of scientists that read peer-reviewed research from climate scientists, and they do a sort of a meta-analysis of what's going on. In 2007, I think that was the third meeting that they had, what they call the assessment report. They concluded that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and by 2013, 2014, their 4th report stated that human influence on the climate system is clear, and recent anthropogenic, human-created emissions of greenhouse gases are the highest in history. And so that report in 2013-2014 is what influenced, I think, 186 countries to convene at Paris and to conclude that they needed to create an accords where they would try and reduce carbon emissions. So we've seen all the negative impact. And so we as Christians, or specifically Orthodox Christianity, what do we teach? How do we take all of this that we're seeing in the world and we've seen in our past, and how are we supposed to actually see it? We take what's called a more Eastern view. Whereas the West was sort of breaking things down scientifically, we were still holding on to appreciating nature in all its glory and seeing a more, not a philosophical view, but a more spiritual view. So early understanding of the environment is that it was there for our pleasure, it was there to be enjoyed, but not the focus of our life. But what we've seen a development over time and an understanding, a full theological understanding, is that the physical world should be incorporated in our daily worship towards God. The first thing that we'll go back to Genesis, and we'll go to verse 31. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. The world was not intended by God to be evil. The things that we see today were not meant to occur. We were meant to have a very wholesome and appreciative view of the world and of what God had created for us. But we were called to tend the garden. We were called to serve God in a way where we took care of creation. But being creatures of free will, we had the choice. And so we know how the story goes in Genesis, that humanity decided in its own free will to separate itself from God. And in doing so, we made our own decisions on how we interacted with the world. And instead of becoming the gardeners or tending to the garden, we began to sow different sorts of seeds, seeds of corruption, as in we would kill, we would dominate, we would use things purely for the act of satisfying our physical needs, rather than attributing it to something higher. What followed afterwards was also materialism, war and cruelty, and also conflict between each other. And so, again, this comes from a misconception of our role. We'll go back to one of the verses that we shared earlier from Genesis 1. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So we know that on a first-hand view, we may interpret this as being the rulers of our individual kingdom, of doing whatever we will over creation. But reading the scripture and being in the community of the church, we have an inherent knowledge of what we should be actually doing. True dominion lies with God and God only. And as Psalm 24 verse 1 starts off with, "The earth is the Lord's." It's not for us to exploit. Even though we are to have dominion, it's more than that. It's not. It comes, I guess we could say, with power comes responsibility. And so, how it's supposed to be is that we tend the garden, we become stewards. And if we read on for other parts of Genesis, you'll see that isolating a particular viewpoint or a particular verse, we take it out of context and we don't see it for what it is. Genesis 1:30, which is slightly before subduing the earth and having dominion. "Also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food, and it was so. Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and to keep it." And so that was sort of the original intention, that God had an idea and a plan for mankind. And why specifically mankind? Callistus Ware, a bishop in America, explains this in his book, The Orthodox Way. "Because man has a rational soul and a spiritual intellect, he possesses the power of self-determination and of moral freedom, that is to say, the sense of good and evil, and the ability to choose between them. Where the animals act by instinct, man is capable of making a free and conscious decision. And the icon that I have there, I found it on Google, but it's a wonderful icon of Christ as God interacting with mankind, with the animals right behind, as if placing authority or responsibility for man over the rest of creation. And we're not just supposed to be stewards or gardeners, but co-creators with God. Following again in Genesis, taking this all into context, Adam and Eve, or Adam specifically in the account, was given the responsibility of naming every creature. And so this creative process, even though that man could not create matter itself, God was allowing the free will of man to take charge and to be involved in the creation process. And reading this, and whatever Adam called each living creature, that was its name. So Adam gave names to all cattle, to the birds of the air, and to every beast of the field. That was probably the first job that Adam was given, other than tending the garden. C.S. Lewis puts it beautifully, and many other authors and writers and theologians put this very well, but I really like this quote from C.S. Lewis. This is an artwork that I've sort of been pining on for years. The old picture of the brutes sporting before Adam and fawning upon him may not be wholly symbolical. Even now, more animals than you might expect are ready to adore man if they are given a reasonable opportunity. For man was made to be the priest and even, in one sense, the Christ of the animals, the mediator through whom they apprehend so much of the divine splendor as their irrational nature allows. And so the next... in a few slides, I'll explain what this means for us as humanity. But God not only just gives us a simple role, but also as we are in his image and likeness, we are called to do what God does to us. It's not just in Genesis that this is discussed, but there are also other references to how things should be done, or the perception of our tenderness towards nature. Proverbs 12:10, a righteous man regards the life of his animal. When you take that whole verse into context, it actually talks about the cruelty of man, but saying that a righteous man, he's not just kind to people, but he's also kind to nature itself. And another interpretation or another contemplation on the Sabbath day, in that the world was created in 6 days. The seventh day was a day of rest, but it wasn't just a day of rest that God had asked man to take, but had also asked for the rest of the world, the rest of creation to take. 6 days you shall do your work, and on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may rest. In the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. So even in the Jubilee year that they would hold in Jewish tradition, early Jewish tradition, that even then there were early practices of resting the land and resting from work. What this means is man is a microcosm. As explained before, that we are a reflection of God onto creation. We are an icon that speaks through to creation from God. Our care and our love for creation is a reflection of our true calling as to the role that God has provided us with. So how should we further our understanding of the environment? Whereas a very primitive understanding is what we would call the anthropocentric view of the world, how everything was made for us. The actual reality of it, at least from the Orthodox perspective, is that we have a Christ-centric view, that everything was made to glorify God, to glorify Christ. And we use Christ as the template. We use him as the icon, the example, or what I've written here, the archetype of how we should interact with the environment. God presents to us how man can share in his continual love by participating with the physical environment as Christ did. So the gospel accounts shows Christ's involvement with nature. We're not expected to perform miracles like he did, but we're expected to have an understanding and a respect for nature. And even when Christ was speaking in parables, he was incorporating the physical world in order to explain divine truths to people in ways that they could understand. A verse from Colossians, or a passage from Colossians, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things consist. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he may have the preeminence. And so that with the broken nature of the world, how humanity had transformed the world before Christ arrived, Christ came for us in order to transform the world, in order to bring it back into the view, into focus as to how we should live in the world that he has created for us, in order to direct our efforts and our deeds towards him. In the incarnation, it's also not just salvation for ourselves, but as I've just mentioned, it's reconciling or redeeming nature and the world. Man's influence has obviously influenced the brokenness of the world. It was a departure from the image that God had, from the image that everything that he had made was good. And there are certain interpretations on how the fall of man also on a very cosmic scale influenced the natural world. But I'll leave that for another time because that's a whole different field. But in simple terms, for it pleased the Father that in him all the fullness should dwell, and by him to reconcile all things to himself, by him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his cross. And so in man being corrected or brought onto a path of correction through Christ, man's nature internally was being restored to what it should have been. And in turn, the influence from man onto nature was on the path to being corrected. And there's also this idea that the life of the world to come not just involves the spiritual world, as we sort of looked at the very beginning of this talk, but also preservation of the spirit, the soul, and the body. And that there is just not the heavenly world, but also the earthly world that will be transformed at the end of days. And this is something that I'll use from one of the early church father quotes. It wasn't just in the early church and the inception of the church. It was there along the way, even though, again, there was a lot of influence that sort of made us backtrack. This is another wonderful passage from one of St. Basil's writings. You'll finally discover that the world was not conceived by chance and without reason, but for a useful end and for the great advantage of all beings, since it is really the school where reasonable souls exercise themselves, the training ground where they learn to know God. Since by the sight of visible and sensible things, the mind is led, as by a hand, to the contemplation of invisible things. And so the world was not just made for the purpose of satisfying us, but in order to teach us on God in the various ways that God sort of shows us through his energies. So using nature, appreciating the wonder and the glory, how challenging it would be for us to sort of create something of our own, but to know that it would be impossible unless a great being revealed himself to us. And also, again, I'll touch on how we use the world as a source of prayer. In Job, there's a little passage about, seeing the glory of God. Ask the animals and they will teach you, or the birds of the air and they will tell you, or speak to the earth and it will teach you, or let the fish of the sea inform you. Which of these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind. In that, the other belief is that every asset of nature in some way can indicate the glory of God or the existence of God or the might of God. This video on YouTube was doing the rounds. It's called Orthodox Environmentalism, and a few friends shared this, so I thought I'd put this on. A priest by the name of Father Andrew Stephen Damick from America had a 3-minute video, and if anyone would like, I'll share the link at the end. I'm just paraphrasing, but he speaks about how the Orthodox Church views the world, or should view the world. If we are the priests, then the earth and creation is a church, a cosmic cathedral where we offer up our prayers to God. And I'll use some examples from the Coptic Church on how we incorporate nature, or we incorporate the physical, to show that we just don't completely discard it. The first and most basic thing is that we use bread and wine, which becomes the body and blood of Christ. Again, instituted by Christ himself, so it's not something that we created. It's something that he wanted us to attribute in order to see the physical and to see reveal the divine truth. Something like incense as well. by using incense, a simple understanding is a representation of our prayers being lifted up, but also for those who have attended an Orthodox liturgy or even other Christian masses, you'll see that all 5 senses are engaged. So the incense influences our smell. We see the actions and the movement in the church. We hear the hymns, the bells, the cymbals, musical instruments. We hear, sorry, I mentioned we hear. We taste the body and blood. What was the other sense? And we touch as well. So the kissing of icons during the Mass, the integration of our holy kisses, which we greet each other with, the kissing of the priest's hands, etc. Iconography. This is a really big one. I mentioned earlier that the world is an icon, but we're also an icon ourselves. Icons are not just pieces of art, they're actually written. The belief in the Orthodox Church that an icon is written, it's not drawn. And so even in the formation of icons, we're not using anything artificial, we're using natural ingredients, we're using egg yolk to produce the gold, we're using ochres and residues and textures to produce the imaging, the images that we see. And it's also the art style that we put a lot of physical symbols. And if you have a look around, you'll see many examples. I've put there as 2 examples, the 4 incorporeal beasts who carry the throne of God, but also the 4 incorporeal beasts represent a different aspect of Christ, and they also represent a different gospel. On the right side, does anyone know who the saint is? I'm not sure if the image quality is great. Saint Mina, thank you. So it's very hard to see, but on the bottom left of the image there, you'll see the 2 camels. So even animals and nature are imparted into the icons to explain the story that's being written. And so the 2 camels bring to mind the story of Saint Mina's body being found or not moving from its location. When they had recovered the body and had located it, they put it on a set of camels who refused to move at a certain point, despite coercing the animals themselves to move. And so the story goes, it was sort of an indication by Saint Mina through God to have a church built there in his name to ask for his prayers. Also in our daily and weekly praises, for anyone that attends Tasbihah, there is a lot of glorification to God given through nature. We use in the Agbeya prayers as well. We quote phrases like or psalms and verses such as Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament shows his handiwork. On the next slide, I'll give you a bit of time to just have a slight read, but Psalm 148 in Tasbihah is one of the more popular psalms where each chorus and phrase is broken in bits and pieces where basically every aspect of nature is being asked to pray and glorify to God. Okay. Also in our feast days, particularly certain days like Palm Sunday and Good Friday, there's use of nature, the palms again, bringing back to the story of Palm Sunday, and Good Friday, the use of flowers and roses to describe or to indicate the Passion. And even in our culture, in the spiritual culture that we have, monasticism originated from Egypt, and ascetic work came from all parts of the world. The misunderstanding that we have of monasticism is that it's a departure from the world, it's a departure from the physical. But anyone that's been to a monastery, either a Western or an Eastern monastery, will see that gardening and work of the tilling of the land and a lot of work and production is going into the efforts of the monks or the nuns. And so there is that involvement with nature, the involvement of remaining in the world and also knowing the purpose of the world. For anyone that, obviously we're all not monks and nuns here, but even our spiritual retreats with church communities often doesn't take us into, say, the city. We're often going out into nature on campsites, out to where we can sort of take away ourselves from sort of the industrialized world. Another point here is, again, focusing on monasticism. This is from a book called Beyond the Shattered Image. The ascetic life, at least in its more authentic expression, is a way of tenderness and of integration with oneself, with each other, and with creation. The Christian ascetic by no means leaves creation outside, but in fact unites the whole cosmos discarded by sin. And the ascetic life is not just a calling for monks, but the ascetic life in the Orthodox Church is also a calling for the individual, for the layperson. So other than just the incorporation of nature and environment and strengthening our understanding of what we need to do in this world, outside the church, what also is our calling? I'm going to harken back to some of the examples of the negative impact that we have on the environment, but also to show that whether Christian or non-Christian, there are contributions that we can make to improve it. So we start with reversing the pollution. We start with cleanup efforts. We start with a more sustainable view, reducing our carbon footprint, recycling, reusing, and not sort of undermining people that go through the effort of trying to make small change. That cultural shift is what helps improve and makes the world a better place. Sustainable practices like crop rotation. If we have a piece of land that's just being weary and broken down, it's not going to work for the future. The nutrition and or the nutrients for the land isn't going to recuperate from overgrazing. And so there's agricultural practices that have been in use and will be continued to be improved upon, which involve just a simple rotation or allowing the time to recover, almost similar to how the Sabbath or the sort of the Jubilee year would be used to rest the land. Living within our means, so instead of overconsumption, trying to be a little bit more efficient with our choices, not buying things that we may not necessarily need, but living within our means, learning to make conscious decisions where we might not buy the extra pair of clothes, or where we may not waste so much food, pacing ourselves. And I think as part of the Coptic Church, we do have fasting as a means to help rejuvenate our mind and sort of bring us back to that. Conservation of flora and fauna. Again, even there are species that we take very little to no notice of that we might not think are very photogenic or needed, but something as cute as the koala is always constantly there. But there's also conservation efforts for things as small as insects and creatures that are needed by other creatures that follow a giant food chain. So even the smallest work done should be encouraged. And also with plant life, I know in some parts of the world they currently store seeds to try and make sure that the species aren't lost in its entirety. The more that we lose, the less variability that we have in the environment, the less things that we're able to produce. This also comes into play by conserving plant life and animal life, the overuse of antibiotics and the use of pesticides. We're now at a very difficult stage where there are basically no new antibiotic classes that are being created, and the fact is that we have to be very careful with the type of medications that we use because of all the resistance that's building up. The challenge now is using things like vaccines and immunization and genetic modification to sort of improve our health without having to rely on medicines, or else the spread of disease leads to a few worldwide disasters. Again, something close to my heart is animal welfare, even changing legislation, allowing livestock to be cared for appropriately, education for adoption over, say, encouraging the unnecessary breeding of animals, leaving only to the experts to do that. Also just assisting welfare agencies through volunteer work, or trying to reduce the number of animals. I'm an advocate for desexing animals, just because of the constant accidents that I see happen, where there are many animals that are rehomed simply because they cannot be given away in time. There was an article that that was shared and given to me by a friend, but within that article I didn't realize this, but there was also the Pan-Orthodox Concern for Animals, an American group, and so there are modern movements, not on the Oriental side so far, but hopefully we'll work towards something like this, where we're educating and changing the culture within, not just within outside the church, but within the church, so that it feels so much more natural to who we are as Christians. Something that I'm not professional about, but thought I should also mention, since we mentioned war. Peacekeeping efforts and treaties, even if they are very small steps. it's something that we need to work towards with being aware of policies being shared by our governments. I can only make very small comments on this, but I feel that we need to be aware because some of these choices, government choices, also influences how it affects not just other people, but the environment itself. In conclusion, creation is the continual expression of God's love as opposed to be only an expression of His will. Orthodox Christianity puts forward that the world was made for us as a medium to interact with Him. Our abuse or abuses of the environment is reflective of our broken nature, and therefore a true return to the image and likeness of God is needed to have a holy and fulfilling interaction with the world and with this world and the world to come. Yeah. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Sure. I might just encourage people to line up. Do we have? No, we don't have a microphone there. Just one there. Is it shareable? No. Okay.
Hey everyone, hey Reggie. Alright, I've got a question about animal welfare.
Yeah.
Now, I really love meat, I love eating meat. However, it's, we can't really deny things like the dairy industry and the treatment of animals and things like that. And I feel, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like a lot of the issues with that industry can't be avoided, like we are contributing to these types of things. So does that conflict with my Christianity to just be eating meat and drinking milk?
That is a question I constantly ask myself. I think I'm very grateful, again, being Coptic. I never appreciated fasting, but fasting helps to ease the conscience, at least, in that I'm not eating meat all the time. I'm not a vegan, by the way, just so you know. I like my meat. But it's being aware of what the practices are, because there's constant improvements. And if we're aware of what the practices involve, then we can put forward legislation that improves the situation. Now, I know with dairy farming in particular, it's very intensive. So it's trying to reduce the intensity, maybe allowing more farms to go at a moderate intensity to allow the cows to rest. Those are options. It's sort of beyond my knowledge because it's a point of conflict for so many people. And then that's why a lot of people do abstain from, drinking milk or being vegan entirely or vegetarian. So I don't have a clear answer for that. It's more pacing ourselves, being aware, and if there's an opportunity to do something about it, then yes, we can. Because even in I think it was Acts, when St. Peter had the vision, and he had all these animals laid before him in the vision, and I think I have it written somewhere here actually. Uncleanliness, there we go. I had this prepared as part of that. So the highlighted bit, what God has cleansed, you must not call common. So it's not that God has called us to abstain from eating meat, although an interpretation of Genesis is that we were vegetarian, we were vegan, we were only eating of what was there on the plants and on the trees. And because of our fallen nature, we are inclined to eat meat. So I can see why returning to that original state might make us feel more comfortable. I don't think it's expected of us though, because there will be people who will just continue to eat meat. They may not have that level of understanding. So it's at the stage of our spiritual life and making that call and saying, well, is it for my benefit? Because some people may choose to live that life and then they lose focus on Christ, and so they can do 100 other things that are wasteful to the environment, but because they're thinking on that one particular act of saving cattle, they may sort of neglect all the other actions because they've got so much tunnel vision. So being moderate in a lot of things rather than focused on one thing might be a starting point. Yeah.
Hey Reggie, thanks for the talk. So my question is, there are a lot of things that are obviously going wrong in the world, so it's really hard to keep track of what you have to do. So what in Christianity sort of can be our unifying principle, whereby if we live, we sort of can avoid all these issues. So how does Christianity, say, compare to secular environmentalism? So what is special about Christianity that can help us avoid all of these environmental disasters and that sort of thing?
I think the beauty of it is that, unlike secular environmentalism, for thousands of years now we have the community of the church, and so that we're not all called to one particular act. God has given us the sentience and given us the knowledge, so that each individual can contribute in some way to the environment. Reading and preparing for this talk, there was just so much information, so many facts, and so many issues with the world. It was almost depressing. But realizing that in my own particular way, I was contributing to at least one facet, and then applying it to my personal life with all the other facets, that I could instigate some change. And so I don't think that the church or God is calling us to try and fix and right all the wrongs, because I think that's impossible. What we try and do is to be as close to the images as we can. And the difference is that we have the church community to rely upon. We understand that there's a bigger picture so that we don't despair. I think secular environmentalism might be very pocketed and individualized. There might be sort of a grand theme of, yes, human interaction is bad, but it might take extremes that Christianity won't. We don't assume that humanity is evil and needs to be purged because we are the sole contributors. No, we're stewards. So we're the ones, if we eliminate ourselves, who else is going to right the wrongs? So it's more taking on that role and correcting it. Hopefully that answered your question.
Simple question, Reggie. Do animals go to heaven?
Okay, there's a backstory to this. So Sam and I have had discussions for years, and this is a point of contention between me and Sam. But Sam has slowly convinced me over time to side with his view. I guess it's not an easy question that we can answer, but I think the simplest thing is we can say what is or what actually happens, and we can just leave it up to God to decide. The thing that we need to know is that yes, there is a life after death for people, and we know how it's expressed, and there is a theology behind it that is just way too expensive for me to explain in a couple of minutes. There is a lot of interpretation in how life after death applies for the rest of the world, and there are lots of church fathers that don't explain the sort of the sentience of animal kind carrying on to the afterlife, but rather the essence of the world for the life to come. There's a transformation, and that there will be sort of a carry-on over. How it is, I don't know. I know that in some saint stories that you might read or might see, such as St. George, for example, or saints with animals by their side, the revealing of the saint within the vision or the prayer or the dream will often be accompanied by their animal. And so that sort of puts into question for me, do they go to heaven? I would like to think so, in whatever capacity it is, but it wouldn't be the same way that we have. The difference between us and the rest of creation, as we've discussed, is that we have rational thought. We also have a spirit. Animals don't have spirits, but there is an essence, there is an expression of God's energies through creation. So simple answer is I don't know, but I'd like them to go to heaven. Any other questions? If you've got a really loud voice. Okay. That makes it easy.
That was really good, thank you. So at the beginning you were talking about, I guess the different influences of how we think about the environment. Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think so culturally, so for those who may have grown up with an Egyptian background or a Coptic background, the environment and caring for the environment is just non-existent.
Yeah.
So my question is, what do you think at what point, and considering everything you've said about, the Orthodox view on the environment, at what point really did we just stop, it was nothing in our minds? At what point did we stop caring about the environment? Was it just because we had other priorities that, other things that are taken priority? So.
Another question I keep asking myself, if anyone's been to Egypt, including myself, you'll see the sort of the third world appearance that it can take, in that our environmental stewardship just as a whole in lots of parts of different worlds, but particularly in Egypt because it hits close to home for us, and that we have the privilege of being here. We know that there's a bit more structure to how we take care of our country. I think it was lost along the way. I think there was a lot of influences. Also the fact that for 1700 years there is that persecution, trying to get by, living with very little and working our way up. I remember a Coptic Orthodox bishop who has been here plenty of times and serves outside of Egypt. He was asked a question on environmental stewardship a couple of years back, and it really hit close to home because the way he responded was, well, if someone told me 10 years ago we needed to care for the environment, I would have sort of scoffed at it. But now I think it's pertinent. We need to do this. It's called upon us to do it. And so there is this changing that we're getting, and hopefully with globalization, the positive side of globalization, or the advancements of technology, possibly the influence from the countries that are well off, they may pass on technologies or practices that can just skip a few generations and just improve things really quickly. But it's if we think progress in Australia is a little bit slow, it's at a snail's pace in Egypt, and that's they have experts, but not enough where it's seen as a priority, up until the point where it becomes a hazard. Another example I'd give from Egypt in particular, I think it was in early 2009, I was in Egypt when the SARS epidemic was sort of spread out. Because of the lack of knowledge and information, the government of Egypt called for the culling of all the pigs that they had in the country. Unfortunately, the owners of the pigs were Coptic Christians, and so I think it was 250,000 pigs were just slaughtered straight away. Probably not humanely. I think I saw a video. It was quite cruel, and a lot of the suddenness without the research meant that they just wanted to go in and do whatever they could. So there is a little bit of responsibility they need to take. Any other questions? Yeah.
So my question was kind of similar. It's along the idea of priorities, and possibly a comment might be that environmental issues are a first world problem. A lot of the like the Paris and the Copenhagen summits found that third world countries or developing countries were bearing more of the burden and hadn't benefited from the the benefits that developing countries had. I guess my question is about priorities, and you mentioned live animal trade. When an environmental issue comes in direct conflict with a humanity issue, so in the concept of live animal trade, where people in developing countries may, through the live animal trade, have access to fresh meat year-round, versus sending it all frozen, and the benefits of that, are arguable, whether it is actually beneficial or not. The principle, I guess, is when human interests and environmental interests conflict, do we have a framework for kind of trying to figure out what is fair and which should take priority? Yeah. Within Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah, I agree. It's more of an integration. For me, it's like why not both? But it's not something that's easy. And as you saw, it's a development. We're still developing the process in which we incorporate the environment. A simple solution would be to transport the cattle to one part of the world and then sort of have it midway, so that that other part of the world can produce its own cattle, and there's a shorter distance to transport. That would be the practical application. If an idealistic world could exist, it's finding that counterbalance, and people's lives are at stake. So it's at least not cutting it off entirely. So I'm not calling for a ban on live export. So if we can preserve meat to the point where it tastes just as well when it's transported for 30 days as it does right here, yeah, sure. But that's a future technological development. But if it's calling for, say, less overstocking of cattle, so the trip is much safer, so they're not in the blaring heat, with little to no movement, then yeah, that's something. We can still transport them, but maybe at a reduced stock, for example. It comes down to money, not really the human aspect. How much can we transport in a shorter period of time? And so that's where, policies come into play. But this is, again, beyond my realm. These are only suggestions and only just at least pointing it out and putting it forward so that people are aware that there are issues, and if our lives are boring, then maybe we should pick a few issues that from different aspects we can both appeal to our fellow man and to creation. That's the integration of prayer in our life, so that we're not thinking that we need to be at church 24 hours a day. We can pray elsewhere in our deeds. Anything else?
So I'm going to go back to animal welfare again, but this is sort of like a general thing, and it might be a silly question, but you were talking about as long as we acknowledge, what's going on or what the situation is. Now, I understand that it makes us better Christians to be knowledgeable and to actively, try to, I guess, sustain our environment, but could it then be seen as a sin or a bad deed to actively choose not to be involved, like, I don't care about that global warming, or I don't care about, how my meat gets, Is that seen as a bad thing, or is it just sort of like, So I don't know, am I even making sense? I'm not sure.
Can we choose to not?
Choose
to ignore it.
Yeah, I understand. Like I said, I understand. It makes us, better Christians to be more in tune with our environment. But can we play the ignorant card on this?
It's interesting that you say that, because I think of it as trying to not be ignorant of the salvation that Christ brings to us. So our calling as Christians, for example, would say, would we be ignorant of preaching the word of God to another individual? No, that's our calling as Christians. And so how would we bring the word of God to that person? There are so many facets. And so if someone is asking you about these issues and you've chosen to be ignorant of the cause, there may be a way that you can touch their hearts by having some information to work with, by saying, this is how I live my life. Some people base their decisions on, the care of the environment. Christians, I think, are seen as very negligent of the environment, that they have no care. I remember experiences at university where there was Christianity was not known for that. And so I think it's necessary. We can choose to be ignorant, but again, as I mentioned, it's very reflective of the role that God has asked us to be the gardener, to be the priest to the environment. So, and again, it's even monks and asceticism is not a denial of the physical, a denial of the environment. It's acknowledging it as the training ground that we need to work for it and with it. So yeah, I can't be a judge because I'm wearing Nike shoes and I feel conflicted about the ethics of wearing that. But at the same time, I'm working my way personally, trying to find out what I can contribute. You can't be expected to do everything, but you should be doing something in some way. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, good answer.
Thanks for the talk, Reggie. It's the first time I actually hear about the topic, so it's good that it's brought up and had its time in the light. I've got a comment and a couple of questions. I don't want to hog. I don't know how... You can just stop me. I think I don't know when to stop. All right, so you mentioned my favorite saint, Saint Mina. You didn't mention the part where he heals the sheep or the cattle that went through, and then that's when the princess found.
I actually didn't mention that, but you've enlightened me to read up on the story. So
yeah, so there's even healing for that. But if I'm honest, and this is like the first question or point to address, I think the examples that you've selected may be a bit selective in a sense. There are things like the flood that destroyed the entire earth, animals, humans, the lot. There's Elijah who stopped the rain and the crops were killed. There were the times when the Jews went from Sinai into Israel, and in overtaking the people of the land, they were commanded not only to kill the people, but to kill all the sheep, their cattle. So those are examples that go against that. So I think for Christianity, it's stewardship is like one of the things that we learned as a kid, but it's not the only factor, and it's a great topic. I wish like we can have a bit more of a discussion about it, because like we're kind of self-selecting as a group. Like people you see in front of you, most of them are going to agree. In the wider Coptic community, you actually have more people that will disagree with you, and it's seen as a lack of faith to worry too much about the environment, to have this alarmism that is, you know, we've had before. Like, you know, God will look after the environment. God created the whole environment for us. You're kind of distracting from the main aim. So there's other things that can point to that.
All right, sure. So I'll go through those 3 points. So the first one was the flood. The second one was
Elijah, and then the killing. There's like examples of where nature wasn't being looked after, basically.
So in all 3 examples, and this goes back to the broken nature of man. In all 3 examples, humanity was at one point just not reconciling with God. And in the first example, the flood, again, there are different ways to interpret the flood and how it applies, but long story short, humanity was so corrupt that God was relenting, that man had degraded so much. And so at that point, in the biblical account, it had never rained. So there was a physiological, or there was an environmental reason for it, for a flood so massive. But also, if it's divinely brought upon the people, which it was, then it was for a greater purpose. And so it wasn't that God was being negligent of the environment, it's that humanity was being even more negligent, and if it continued the way it would, they would be doing much more damage. The story of Elijah is withholding rain from a certain area of the world for a certain period, again because of the corruption of, I think it was the kingdom at the time. And the third account was also Sinai, again, the slaughtering of sheep. There are lots of accounts in the Bible. There are bits and pieces that I've been reading and I can't sort of resolve it in my head. But the understanding is that there is a greater picture. If we weren't Christians, we wouldn't see the grander picture of why things had to be done. And it comes back to humanity's relationship with mankind and the deviation from our role. And so if the sheep were slaughtered, they were probably being misused anyway. That they were fighting over the sheep, they were killing each other in the first place. I can't justify it, but certainly that's what we're here for. We're here for to take, because it's a very realistic viewpoint that humanity is not perfect, but what we're here for is to work towards the point where we never have to do that again. And so far we haven't been, but in parts of the world that still exists. It's a history is repeating itself, but now we're a little bit more enlightened to what we should be doing. So hopefully that's a balance, and again, there will be a lot of people who will disagree, but it's and it comes back to the previous question of where our priorities lie. And you know, I understand that the need for prayer and the need for action needs to be balanced. If someone has a calling to a particular thing, then that person is, again, I take it as a form of integration and prayer. So personally, from my experience, the number of it's a Middle Eastern mindset, but it's also a mindset that I've seen from different nationalities. Animal welfare is just more pragmatic than you know, genuinely concerned. So there's a level, and it's more about education, saying, no, we can do better, we can do this, we can do that, and it's not pushing myself where I lose myself. It's trying to at least bring a little bit of Christ into my work. Yeah.
Fair enough. We can do the questions? Okay. So my summary of that is that there's the fallen nature, fallen world, and that plays into why there was a flood and animals died. Like if that's one way to summarize that. Yeah.
The natural death is something that we have tried to discuss. Did it exist before the creation, like before the fall of man? Well, we can at least say that spiritual death didn't exist before the fall of man, and then it did. Natural death is a different thing. So there's the expectation that we live in a world where things will die. Yep. It's in the manner in which they die that we need to think about. And God, being the true person who has dominion over creation, He can make the call, because, you know, if He can make the call, then He might be doing what's best as well. He knows what to do.
Fair enough.
Yeah. It's a difficult question, and probably someone with a bit more experience and maybe a more spiritual background will give you some insight on that.
Sorry if I looked it up, there might be some answers. It's just this topic that's not discussed, and I'm just happy that we get to discuss it tonight.
It's something that I've been wrestling with myself, and like the discussions that I've had with other people, it's what do you do when God takes matters into his own hands? Well, we don't despair, that's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
We acknowledge that he's doing it for a reason, or he may not have any involvement at all. Maybe it's a natural reflection. Maybe he had to let nature take its course, or had to show the cruelty. But that's trying to justify something that we don't have an entire context on. It may be exaggerated. There are exaggerated accounts in history, even maybe in a biblical sense, that when they say they killed and slaughtered everything, how many sheep were actually there? Maybe they had 10 sheep, not 10,000.
Yeah, we're not going to make Reggie justify God's actions, and it's not fair.
Playing devil's advocate is not fun.
Yeah. Just to the last point that I was making, which is that environmentalism, there was a bit of an alarmism aspect of it, especially like when it kind of started, especially with climate change specifically. Like we didn't have that with the ozone layer, but there's also so there's the lack of faith. There's alarmism to do with that, which shows lack of faith, and it's associated with atheists who don't believe in the afterlife. So this is the life and that's all they care about.
From a fear of death or fear of the unknown. Yeah.
And then there's the fact that it's lumped up with other progressive issues. It's things like the Greens. It's abortion, feminism. Like they all tend to be lumped together, and that.
Yeah.
So that I think maybe somebody will bring up that point, but it's something that I wanted to bring up because it does stop us from, makes us averse to being environment friendly.
Yeah.
But the question that I actually just wanted to ask, the last one answered, is about genetic modification, whether it's something that we, like if there's a church view of it and what you think.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So trying to create things entirely new for me is a bit challenging. But if you're talking about genetic integration, where one case study in high school was getting the certain genetics of salmon in the Antarctica, I think it was, and then integrating it in certain strawberries. The strawberries could then be more resilient in the winter. That's like a common example that I'll share with people. Or genetic modification to improve the health. But if you're talking about selecting babies by gender and things like that, that's playing on the very minute, that's playing on so many variables that there is cause for concern. And so I strike a balance. God has asked us to tend the garden, not to create something out of nothing. But that's my personal view. And back onto the sort of the previous viewpoint, I don't want to lump every atheist or every secular person under the same area, because there are a lot of people that will draw a line with certain things and certain aspects. Again, it comes back that we have a community within the church, and that we try and strike a balance, and that it's not more of alarmism but integration in our lives. And so because we're so far back in our understanding, everything seems relatively more alarmist. But if we're at a certain level and it's common practice, then we're sort of at a state where, okay, we've heard the comments, we know what's real, and it's just gathering the facts. But again, that's sort of out of my field of knowledge. It's more about creating some sort of awareness, seeking guidance from God, from the spiritual sense, and then acting upon it with some of the knowledge. God's given us sentience and a brain to work out. It's not that we should be negligent of the world. I think we should build towards at least contributing in some way. I'm not asking that we should all give up our jobs and hug trees, but certainly at least doing the small bits. How often do we clean our churches? That's charity starts at the home, and then we extend that. Another example is just like the Japanese soccer team and the Japanese fans in the World Cup. Every World Cup they'll clean after themselves. That's a huge cultural shift for an entire country, which they've integrated in their schools. Imagine us doing that with our churches, with our Sunday school system, or even just generally in our schools. You can create generations of people where it's just the norm and there's no need for alarmism, because there's a bit more trust in the science, or in the facts. You might have to need a permanent seat there. Can everyone hear me, by the way? I'm speaking a little bit offhand from the microphone.
Hello again. This isn't a question, this is a comment actually, but I thought it was so beautiful that I had to share it with everyone. But it's not mine, it's Rania's, and she was embarrassed to come up here. So I'm just going to show everyone that's Rania over there. Most of you guys know her. Anyway, she was saying, no, I thought it was actually really beautiful to sum up all of this, but she was saying if we look at the Creator, we look at God, you know, He has dominion over His whole creation, yet He came to sacrifice Himself for us, and, you know, out of His love for us and, you know, love for His own creation. If that's God, then if we have, you know, dominion over the earth, how much more should we, or not more, but how much should we try to imitate that same love? I didn't say it so eloquently as she did, but, you know, I thought it was nice.
It's a good attempt.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, you didn't hear the original. I probably made it better.
We can ask her later. Any other questions at all? I got hammered with these questions today. All right. Is that it? That it? I'll pass it on to Mina to end the talk. I'll be around if anyone wants to discuss or argue or say things they wouldn't say in public, but that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Reggie. It was a very challenging topic tonight, and you put a lot of effort with the team that helped. Thanks for another lovely talk.